The profound and wondrous Dharma is rarely encountered, even in 100 million kalpas. Having it to hear, accept, and maintain, may I taste the truth of the Tathagata's words. Good morning. Can you hear me okay? Is that volume all right? Yeah. For some people. For Tomas. Thank you, Tomas, for the thumbs up. Let's see. I am Dojin Sarah Emerson. I use the pronouns she and her for those I haven't met. And good morning. Welcome to Stone Creek. Or welcome back. I am having the long lost opportunity to practice with being sick, which I haven't been in a really long time, thanks to, masks and whatnot, being in our house. And this week, we don't have COVID, but our son and then me and now Charlie, we've all succumbed to this respiratory illness. And I was a little put out, I will confess. I was like, this is amazingly inconvenient. And also I'm appreciating the practice. There's a practice, there's the humility of our human body. And I know very well now, all I need to do is rest. My body has the capacity to heal. And it was very interesting this week for me to practice with knowing that clearly, and then what also happened, like the momentums of my habit energy and the tendencies of my life that both did and did not allow it, so it's really just excellent territory of practice. And I sound stuffy, and let me know if my voice drops, because my throat is sort of getting better, but a little sore. I feel like I'm in a, like there's a container over my head. This morning, I would like to offer some reflections on beginner's mind, and offer a contemplation I've been having for a while now about beginner's mind, that it's not like a state of innocence and purity that we just have to return to, but actually instead it's a cultivation of maturity. So I'll get into that. Thank you for coming along with me. And to start that, I wanted to invite us to take a moment and maybe, however it works for you, to bring your full awareness. I'm closing my eyes because I realize that's helpful for me. Into your body, into our bodies, to feel our breath. I can feel my chest squeezing, actually. And to bring our conscious awareness to our ancestors. And by that I mean broadly, so certainly we can include our biological ancestors, but our spiritual ancestors, our cultural ancestors, our communal, local, regional ancestors. And just give a few moments to honoring that they are here in us. And maybe consciously inviting any beneficial input they may have. And consciously not inviting any harm or unskillfulness that they may still be working with, while knowing that some of what we inherit in this world and in our lives and in our bodies and in our families and in our physical being on this planet is the result of a lot of pain and unskillful actions and trauma. So we can honor that, and we can also, but more what we're inviting is the love and benefit. And I hope as I'm talking it will make sense how that goes for me with beginner's mind and with being present in any moment. So probably my first introduction to Zen, like many white Westerners I have heard from, it was the book Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. And then I had the great joy of practicing in the community that was founded by Suzuki Roshi, who wrote that book, Shunryu Suzuki Roshi, at the San Francisco Zen Center, and practicing with many of his students. And yeah, Suzuki Roshi is certainly one of the ancestors who had a tremendous impact on the way my life has unfolded, even though he died about 6 months before I was born. It was fun to revisit Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. If any of you, if people have read it, or if you've never read it, please have a look. And if you have read it, please revisit. It's really like all good teachings, There's always layers and layers, and so they speak to us more and more subtly over time. And he starts, these are, they look like essays, but I think they were actually transcriptions of talks that were edited, short talks in that book. And he says, in Japan, we have a phrase, shoshin, which means beginner's mind. The goal of practice is always to keep our beginner's mind. And I was recently asked to talk about this in a different setting that wasn't a Buddhist or Zen setting. And then this whole and what came into my heart really deeply was, I hear actually the phrase that I hear often and is quoted often, and again, like far beyond Zen settings, at least in my experience in the United States, is that expression, in the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind, there are few. I've seen this really widely quoted. And it can have a feeling of and I see it actually utilized to be like, we just need to return to childlike innocence. And I would like to offer, like, we can't, number one. There's no such thing. We are, what we are is the accumulation of our experiences. And that childlike innocence, while we can learn from children, certainly, there's ways that as adults we can learn from how children engage with things. That's not actually beginner's mind. That beginner's mind is an ongoing effort that we make. And that actually it isn't innocence. In some ways, it's exactly the opposite. And that the cultivation we make is to be more and more, deeper and deeper, more and more subtly, more and more expansively aware of the magnitude of what is present in every moment, so that we can fully meet with great care and particularity whatever is precisely in front of us. So it's a little bit paradoxical, but almost like the wider our capacity is to open to the vastness of what's present, the more fully that we can deal with that, and then that's where I think the cultivation comes, and we can open to it and not freak out and not be defended against it. Then we can more precisely and almost singularly meet what's in front of us, and that's beginner's mind. In that essay, he talks about a kind of purity, and again, I think this is where we can really misinterpret. He said, people say practicing Zen is difficult, but there's a misunderstanding as to why. It's not about the posture or attaining enlightenment. It's difficult because it's hard to keep the mind, quote, pure. And I'm interested in helping you keep your practice pure. I feel like this has been or I don't know. Actually, I'm not sure what Suzuki Roshi meant at all. But I would argue that that's a tricky word to use there, and leads us away from opening to messiness of reality. Oops. Sorry, let me put myself on the speaker view. Also in this essay, he says, possibly, if I had to pick a favorite, my favorite sentence about Zen study from Suzuki Roshi, which is, For Zen students, the most important thing is to not be dualistic. So there, for me, that's a map, or that's a guide for understanding what he means by purity, and understanding what he means by, in the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, and the expert's mind, there are few. The cultivation of beginner's mind, again, so not about returning to a childlike state, but a kind of fruit of maturation and cultivation of abiding in the complexity and the vastness of non-duality. And a better way, I think, of saying that is the connectedness of every moment to all things and to everything. There's a conception of innocence as something, I don't know, if I'm honest about like how I've seen it portrayed in my life, it's not only benign but sort of positive. You know, innocence is pure, actually. And I deeply appreciate the awakened understanding that James Baldwin brings to the idea of innocence, about how distorting it is. You know, as adults, like we are, again, we're this accumulation of so many experiences. If we're abiding in innocence, and not that there isn't a kind of like, you know, well, I do want to, it is important to play. It is important to allow childlike qualities to come forward. But when we do that as adults, we don't lose sight of, I think if we do that in maturity, we don't lose sight of all we have seen and all we know. And in that way, the play is even more sweet, actually. It's even more joyful. Because we can have joy, even while knowing there is great devastation, even while knowing death, even while knowing grief and loss. And so this idea of innocence being innocent, that I think what Baldwin is pointing to critically is particularly how it works in white America, or white dominant culture in America, is the deliberate not seeing, the deliberate closing of eyes and of understanding and of perception. A friend of mine who's not white was for example, here's like a way it's happening right now. They were saying, you know, like in the United States, all over the place. I mean, actually, there's a lot of outbreaks of COVID, but there's a lot of people who are like, let's get back to normal and let's party, which, you know, closing our eyes to. Many countries in this world have not even begun to have vaccinations available. You know. So how, you know, so just like so that doesn't mean we don't have joy and we don't gather with our friends and we don't celebrate, but can we celebrate and include this understanding, you know, that there is pain ongoing that many, 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 many people have not yet transcended. So James Baldwin says, it is not permissible that the authors of devastation should also be innocent. It is the innocence which constitutes a crime. And you know, this is from The Fire Next Time. That I think is really important to hear in its whole context. So I'm not going to do this justice. But what I think is really, what I feel he's pointing to is the distortion of denial. And the way that not seeing, and again, particularly for white Americans, and particularly for white Americans in power, creates a kind of twisting, and is very dangerous. He also says people who shut their eyes to reality, and reality, again, being the complexity of all that's here in any moment, simply invite their own destruction. And anyone who insists on remaining in a state of innocence long after that innocence is dead turns themselves into a monster. You know, and as we are watching the outflows of climate catastrophe, I would argue that a lot of closing of our collective eyes to the impacts of what we as human beings, I mean here, we're doing along the way, is now, these are the results. We're living in the physical results of that. Those of us who are in California are, we know. The soil is so dry. My son and I went to camp in our backyard, and the soil is so dry that I can't get any purchase with the tent stakes. It just goes poof, and in a notable way this year. I want to take a moment to think about what we talk about in Zen, in Soto Zen, as the 3 times of past, present, and future. In terms of like what is reality? Reality is, I think it's useful to see reality as the fullness of past, present, and future that are always here. So in every moment, the vast accumulation of the past is actually shaping what's happening. And we're pivoting toward what happens in the future, which is shaped by what's happening in the past and happening now. So as Bodhisattva practitioners, we keep our eye on this, because then it really matters. First of all, it matters to be aware of what's come before us, and it matters what we're doing now, because all of that will shape what happens. And that I feel like I keep quoting this one thing over and over in every talk, but again, it's like any good Zen or any good teaching, right? It's like, for me, this teaching from the Genjo Koan keeps opening and keeps opening and keeps opening. The teaching of when Dharma when Dharma does not fill your body and mind, you think it is already sufficient. When Dharma fills your body and mind, and I would actually change that to say, like, when we come from the vantage point of Dharma, or I feel like that explains it better to me. When we come from the vantage point of Dharma, we understand that something is missing. And this something that's missing is the vastness of all the conditions that have led here. So I don't mean to say that we can make sense of or grasp or even name all the conditions that are present in every moment. But I do want to suggest that as practitioners, we open to, wow, there's a vastness here that I want to account for. And I think it can be useful to look into our particular, so this is why I think it can be useful to look into our particular conditioning. Like, what were the things that shaped us as people that we can see, knowing that, it's the micro tip of an iceberg of vastness, that the conditions that shaped us are far beyond our reckoning. But it is really interesting to take our Dharma, our mature Dharma perspective, and look back and be like, what were those? Like over the last 2 nights, Charlie and our son Loka and I watched the Star Wars from 1978. This was so impactful on me as a child. I was 7 years old. I was born in 1971. Star Wars was archetypally impactful on me as a child. I wanted to grow up to be Luke Skywalker, or maybe marry him. I didn't care. Either way. I wanted to be / date him. But actually, when I was 7, I didn't want to date him. I just wanted to be him. I wanted to be the hero. And actually, as we were watching it, it was really striking to me how amazingly white and male the cast was. And I couldn't help but treat our son to my commentary on that. Because it really was striking. Like, there were 2 women actually in the entire movie. There's Princess Leia and then Luke's aunt. It's quite striking. So that's actually, and as we watched it too, I could smell and picture the movie theater that I saw it in Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts, where I was that summer. And another very 70s, so I apologize for those who, this is not the cultural impacts that you had. Memory that I had was of the Brady Bunch. Are people familiar with the Brady Bunch? So it's this story of the foundational principle of the story is there's a a white woman and her 3 daughters, biological kids, and a white man and his 3 sons, and they something happened to the other parent of each of those families, and they are a blended family. They come together and create the Brady Bunch. In fact, that's what the song is in the beginning. I spent like 2 days singing the song. And as a child, even, I was like, wait, what happened to the other parent? Like, the conceit was that the mom was the biological mom of the girls, and the dad was the biological dad of the boys. But their other parent was just not in the field. And they came together and they lived happily ever after, and nobody talked about it. Like, nobody ever mentioned it. Nobody thought about it. The kids did not ask. It was the 70s, and these were white people in California. I remember as a kid being like, wait, what happened to their other parents? And asking my parents, and they're like, Sarah, it's a TV show. It's not real, And I'm like, what does that mean? Doesn't somebody wonder about their other parent? And to me, it just was very, I don't mean to go too far into pop culture, but that speaks to a way I was conditioned as a child. There wasn't anything before now. Here we are. We don't talk about the people who aren't here. The last talk I gave when I was talking about, like, we ask the question, if we want to be inclusive, we ask the question, who's not here? The Brady Bunch family did not ask the question, who's not here? It was not asked. And as an adopted parent, our son was adopted at birth. I think a lot about his ancestors, and my relationship to them, and my responsibility to them, and my own connection. And then there's my son's connection, which I have to support happening, but I have to have my own, as his parent, I have to find my own responsibility and relationship to my son's ancestors. I am raising their little one. And similarly, I have to find that relationship to my own ancestors that truly I know up to my great-grandparents. I know their names maybe. And I know a few qualities of my great-grandparents, and that's it. But as a living being, actually, I need to feel into my relationship and my responsibility to all these ancestors. And that's effortful. And I argue, as in practice and in the Bodhisattva vow, is really worth doing. One of the things that happens, even if we had very difficult relationships with the people we come from, when we acknowledge their presence in our lives, is that we understand ourselves as part of a web of relationships. And it helps shake up the delusion of a separate self, because we're not. Many people I know, especially in California, kind of created lives in opposition to the environments they were raised in. And so there can be this feeling of like, my life started once I cut that off. And sometimes we need to do that, actually. Like, I don't mean to minimize the necessity of that sometimes, because of so much trauma, actually, and pain. And also to honor whatever came before us. We carry it. We are in relation to it. And it shapes us. And not to be afraid of it, I think, is maybe the most important. Be afraid of it. Whatever was behind us, there was some beneficence there, and we can almost like draw that out as we heal the parts that were not beneficial. I was really deeply moved by Molly's talk last week, and in so many ways, and I went back to revisit it. And she was talking about the narrative, Michael White and David Epstein, the founders of narrative theory or narrative therapy, and their observation that lots of human beings have a tendency to only take in information that validates sort of the patterns of what we already know to be true, and so that in that way we're filtering for the world to be validating to our worldview, and we're filtering out things that challenge or that challenge our worldview. And you know, I'm sure many of you have seen these kind of studies of Facebook as a good example, and many social media things that this is they make algorithms to do just this. They take this human tendency and they amplify it tremendously, so that what you're getting, that it actually exploits that human tendency to only take in what validates our worldview, and how very, first of all, how very exploitative that is, but secondly, how very, very dangerous that is, and is a big factor in the divisiveness in the United States and in many places. And so what we cultivate as practitioners, as practitioners of the Bodhisattva way, is the opposite. To cultivate beginner's mind is to cultivate the capacity for something new, moment after moment after moment after moment. We can take the most mundane moments of our lives and challenge ourselves. What is new here? And that this is like part of the cultivation, building that muscle and capacity for living in reality, which is a constantly evolving, complex mess. And that, and the reason we do this isn't simply so that we get to be like, I don't know, more interesting or something. It's that, first of all, to open to that is to live in reality as opposed to living in delusion. And secondly, it's to broaden our capacity for skillful engagement in the world. The narrowing reduces our skillful possibility. The opening increases our skillful possibility. And if we want to respond to the suffering in the world, we really need to be skillful. A Dharma teacher and friend that I get to teach with in the Dharma Materialism course, Leela Bothwell, gave a talk in the fall where she talks about, you have to see ourselves coming. To be a bodhisattva, we have to see ourselves coming. To be skillful in the world, we have to see ourselves coming. So there's this way that we both look for, we open to what's new, we care about that capacity, and then we also deeply study what our habit energies are, and what our habituated patterns, and what our inheritances are, and what our conditions are, so that we see ourselves coming. So we know, I bet I know how I'm going to respond to that. And so that if we get that out in front of us, where our conscious awareness can work with it, it doesn't have as much sway over our capacity to take in what's here. Oh, I tend to shut down around people like that, for example. Oh, okay, yeah, I know that. So knowing that, can I listen to see if I can hear what this person has to say, even though they fit a stereotype I have in my head where I usually shut down? Can I open to that? Molly in her talk said, so this is part of the practice of liberation. The process might begin with questioning those pre-digested, like chewed up in the way a mother bird does, the pre-digested meanings that have conditioned all of us in different ways since our birth. Meanings assigned by culture, by our time, by our families, peers, meanings that feel kind of inevitable to us, but are really only one possibility among infinite ones. I really love this. In some ways, like we could extrapolate that to like when we're noticing that the world is validating our worldview, we can question a little what's going on there. We can use it as a guide. Am I getting narrower here? Is there something I'm not seeing? That this longing that I have for my worldview to be validated and to feel a sense of belonging in this, which is totally legitimate and human, but is it blinding me? Or is it, I want to be careful with the word blinding for those who don't have sight and have that not be pejorative, but just, is it limiting my ability, my capacity to understand what's here? And she quoted, I had totally forgot about, I was totally moved by this T.S. Eliot quote, and then I forgot about it because the talk was so rich, but listening to her talk again, she quoted T.S. Eliot saying, "There is, it seems, at best only a limited value in the knowledge derived from experience." So again, like we may not be conditioned to trust our actual experiences. We might be projecting forward our past ones and having that limit our view. And then he says, "The knowledge imposes a pattern and falsifies, for the pattern is new in every moment, and every moment is a new and shocking valuation of all that we have been." I haven't spent time with T.S. Eliot since I was in my early 20s, when my friends and I would read it and be like, yeah. And I went down a T.S. Eliot rabbit hole yesterday, and hopefully I'll come back around at the end of the talk to sharing the writing that poem around that, because it taught me something anew about what I'm trying to point to with beginner's mind. We'll see if we have time. I really love this the new and shocking valuation of all that we have been. So it's both things, right? There's the novelty of the uniqueness of each present moment, and the depth of everything that we have that led us to right here. And that to be present and to have, quote, beginner's mind, is to be at the juncture of those two somewhat paradoxical things. And that we can maybe only perceive the novelty and the shocking newness if we have some fluency with what came behind us. And Zazen practice, so how do we cultivate this? There's lots of ways, but one practice I would say is Zazen practice, or meditation practice, is when we sit in meditation, we're developing the capacity to be to be at that juncture, to tolerate and be at the juncture of all that's arising, fresh and deeply conditioned, all at once. And I realized as I was thinking about this, I was like, oh, Zazen is like, it's a practice of being with the vastness, but it's also the practice of being whole. The wholeness of each of us in every moment. You don't have to shut out the pain from the past. You don't have to shut out the difficult relationships. You don't have to shut out the trauma. I mean, sometimes you do if it's overwhelming, but Zazen gives us a context in which we're somewhat, not always, but the hope is it's an environment that's safe to sit down and allow the wholeness of everything we carry, meeting the freshness of what's here. And as I thought about that, I thought, speaking for myself, like I wasn't really conditioned to be whole. If I'm being honest, like I wasn't. I was conditioned to be parsed off in pieces. I was conditioned actually to be pretty dissociated from my body, pretty dissociated from my somatic experience, dissociated for the most part from my ancestry, from the land I lived on, from the history of what happened there, from the past. I was fairly well conditioned to be dissociated and disconnected from other people, even in my relationships, and also from myself, what T.S. Eliot points to of my experience, like what I learned from my experience. I was taught like, well, don't rely on your experience, rely on books and science and those old people telling you how it is. And that's actually, it doesn't set a person up to be whole. It set me up to be somewhat fractured. And I feel like a lot of my adult life, especially in practice, has been trying to reintegrate. I just want to mention a couple other kind of cultural practices that I see as efforts at reclaiming the past into the present. And one of them is land recognitions. So there's a practice a few years ago when if people haven't been by Stone Creek, I recommend going by. And because for many years we watched as that there was a field across from Stone Creek that was just kind of, just sitting there. I mean, actually, it was being a field, and probably it was a nice place for a bunch of mice and other people that got displaced. But now it's a thriving little community of houses and a park. And when that park went in, we were asked by the people who were helping to bring that green space to Grayton to come and do a blessing for it. And I don't know, I wasn't consciously aware of land recognitions as a thing, but I remember feeling that it was important to just name the indigenous folks on whose land we were standing and honor that that's part of what was happening there. We were standing on land that belonged to Southern Pomo and Kosumiwak people. And then I was learning that land recognitions are, at least in my experience in Northern California, like this is an effort that people are making. It is not sufficient to simply name, the land that we're on, but it's an effort to counterbalance the centuries of not seeing for those of us, and this is not everyone, but for those of us who were taught to not see. I want to, let's see, I'll put this in the chat. I'll put this link. So there is in Chicago, this giant banner. And here it is both in Potawatomi language. I don't know how to pronounce that, so I won't try. And then also translated into English. And this giant banner, and then there's an article about it if you want to look at it, says, "You are on Potawatomi land in the middle of the city of Chicago," by an indigenous artist. Her name is Andrea Carlson. And it's again, like, is it enough to name these things? I mean, for indigenous folks, it's, I have no opinion. They, whatever healing needs to happen, I want to support happening. Is it enough for white people to name the indigenous land that we're on? No. Actually, there's a whole bunch of learning that I feel like we're responsible to do. In the same way I'm responsible to my son's ancestors, we're responsible to know who was here for us. How can we care for our relationships? And it's an effort to begin to see what people like me were taught to not see. Don't see this. I was in a group, I think I was at Stone Creek actually, but I don't remember what the group was. And there was I think it was a man who was white talking about indigenous people in the past tense. And I was like, oh, there are lots of indigenous folks in Sonoma County. I looked it up. There's actually 4,000, in some census, 4,395 people who identify as indigenous. I knew about the Federated Indians of Great Rancheria, which is do people know about Great Rancheria? The Rancherias are like tribes in this area. This was like the system of how it worked in this region. And Great Rancheria was only newly restored in 2020. Is that right? In the last few years. I might be getting that wrong. Sorry, I wrote it down somewhere. In 2000. And it's a coming together of a number of distinct folks who are from different regional tribes. There are also the Cloverdale Rancheria of Pomo Indians, the Coast Miwok, Dry Creek Rancheria Band of Pomo Indians, Kashaya Band of Pomo Indians of the Stewart's Point Rancheria, Koi Nation, Lytton Band of Pomo Indians, and then Pomo Indians. So these are all federated tribes that are recognized in Sonoma County alone. There's a full life of indigenous folks here. And that's important to know. If the stories from your childhood and my childhood were that Native Americans were people of the past. In fact, actually, Greg Saris, who's the chairman of the Great Rancheria Federation, who has a really interesting story, he wrote a book called Grand Avenue, and then it was made into a movie in 1996 about an indigenous family that ends up moving back to Grand Avenue neighborhood in Santa Rosa. I haven't had a chance to watch it yet, but so it's just contemporary life of American Indians. And another piece, because I know that the people are hearing about this in the news, there's a lot of attention being given to the bodies of children that are, sorry, that are being exhumed in Canada, who are indigenous at indigenous boarding schools that were government boarding schools for indigenous kids, but it's happening in the United States as well. And I'm just including in the chat an article about the youth groups in the Rosebud community in this one. Actually, there's a lot of this happening. Going to Carlisle, which was a very big boarding school in the United States that brought kids from all over the country who were indigenous, and bringing their remains back, rehoming their remains, reclaiming the bodies of the children who had died that were buried there. This is this like the very literal caring for the past and the present. And as I thought about these young folks doing this, these youth groups that were spearheading this activity, I was like, yeah, they are. So they're reshaping how the future will look because they are reclaiming the past. And I want to ask us as bodhisattvas to deeply support them. The last thing I want to just mention, and then I'll share that longer piece from T.S. Eliot, and I'll put it in the chat too so you can see it, is that as we do this practice of opening, of like studying ourselves so that we know ourselves, so that we can see ourselves coming, so we can account for what's here, so we can meet what's new, kind of a lot. Sounds kind of tiring, but it's worth doing, I think. That we acknowledge that opening to the past is opening to a lot of pain. There's a reason why, like for me, a lot of my ancestors were like, I don't want to talk about it. There's a lot of trauma and very few supports for dealing with it. So it's legitimate, actually, to me, in my heart. There's a legitimacy to the cutting off. It was protective. And I want to offer that opening to that pain, first of all, is okay. It won't destroy us. It might be difficult, so we need Sangha and we need one another. But we also we do that so that the joy that we feel in our life is more true, so that we're more whole. In his talk a couple of weeks ago, Charlie talked about being in denial or being detached as a kind of closed-heartedness. And that really struck me, because denial is very familiar from my upbringing. But to name it as closed-heartedness finally made me understand how it causes so much destruction. It cuts us off from relationship and connection. And it cuts us off from joy. So that a mature, like beginner's mind kind of joy is the joy that includes the pain of the past and doesn't have to banish it. That joy is unconditioned on being cut off from the pain that we also know, from the sorrow that we also know. Okay, so let me just quickly put this in so you can read it along with it. So I just want to offer this longer piece and just tell you, that it taught me something about, T.S. Eliot articulated for me something I wasn't able to articulate about cultivating beginner's mind, and this is what I'll leave us with. Oops. Sorry, my computer. my C key doesn't really work all the time. So if I try to copy things, it doesn't necessarily hear me. But I want to put it there so you don't just have to hear me reading it, you can read along. Ah, it's too long. Oh. Okay. Here's what I'll do. I'll read it and then I'll put it there later if you want to have it. So that sentence that Molly, or the couple of sentences that Molly offered, are from the East Coker section of the Four Quartets, the second section of that. What was to be the value of the long looked forward to, long hoped for calm, the autumnal serenity and the wisdom of age? Had they deceived us or deceived themselves, the quiet voiced elders, bequeathing us merely a receipt for deceit? The serenity only a deliberate hebetude, the wisdom only the knowledge of dead secrets, unless in the darkness into which they peered or from which they turned their eyes, there is, it seems to us, at best, only a limited value in the knowledge derived from experience. The knowledge imposes a pattern and falsifies, for the pattern is new in every moment, and every moment is a new and shocking valuation of all we have been. We are only undeceived of that which, deceiving, could no longer harm. In the middle, not only in the middle of the way, but all the way, in a dark wood, in a bramble, on the edge of a grimpen, where there is no secure foothold and menaced by monsters, fancy lights, risking enchantment. Do not let me hear of the wisdom of old men, but rather of their folly, their fear of fear and frenzy, their fear of possession, of belonging to another or to others or to God. The only wisdom we can hope to acquire is the wisdom of humility, and humility is endless. And again, I'll put that in the chat. But that's the last thing I want to leave us with is, that's beginner's mind, I think, is the humility to be awed by everything that we think we have known and meet it again and be amazed by it. And the humility to look freshly at each moment and be amazed by it. And the cultivation is not the cultivation of innocence, but the cultivation of humility. Thank you. So please let me know if you have any thoughts or or comments you'd like to share.
Dojin, thank you for your talk. It's very provocative for me, and I have the longer I practice Zen, the more the triple treasure, the treasure of Sangha, keeps sort of rising in stature and importance, and it feels like this whole issue of only letting in what's familiar, not consciously, but that whole vicious circle of we only see or recognize or acknowledge that which reinforces what we already know or what we think is right, that we really need the perspective of others. We really need to have them in our lives regularly and often and offering up their point of view. And the more I read like about an anti-racism literature and whatnot, it comes down to seeing people as individuals and hearing everyone everyone's story for what it is, for what their truth is, for what they're saying. So anyway, I just wanted to ask you about in Zen practice the treasure of the Sangha and the treasure of alternative and augmentative perspectives, helping us expand and widen.
I don't know if I have much to add except an amen. That is the treasure. I think we think, and sometimes it is the treasure that sometimes in a world that feels so brutal, we take refuge in folks who are like-minded. Um, so that I understand that, but I also think that the real treasure is our uniqueness coming together and being respected. And I think in Sangha, the one thing that we can always kind of, the word that's coming to my mind is demand, or strive for, is mutual respect. And so it's like, in Sanghas, at least there's environments where we can have mutual respect about the variety of lived experience, and valuing hearing one another. Thank you. Any other thoughts? It's okay if there's not. Yeah, Liz, go ahead.
I feel like each of us has just much more capacity to interact with the people around us that have simple needs, like so that this awareness can be translated into gestures that in relationship with the people that we're interacting with. And whether it's if you have kids in school tutoring some other kid who's just who's a language English language learner, spending a little time, or maybe driving someone to a swimming class so that they don't end up being a statistic in the river. That there's just so many ways to bring this awareness into some not complicated thing, like realizing that someone can't, the schools, for example, or like kids can't do after school programs when their parents are working. And so being able to provide transportation to an outside activity for some child that would never be able to do that. And I'm giving you just a few examples that came up in my life, but I just think we're so worried about being, sometimes when we're talking about all this, about being correct, sort of politically correct, I don't know, seeing the whole picture, and that if we dive in, then we have opportunities to open our field and see more and learn more about ourselves and these attitudes that we're talking about. But,
Thank you so much, Liz. I think there was a deficit of practical how-tos. And I really like this. I really like what you're pointing to. Like, this isn't fancy. Don't get fancy about it, or don't get complicated about it. It's just how we meet each moment, and that has and one of the places where we can really work with that is how we meet one another, and what are the needs around us that we can respond to. Yesterday I was thinking about the concept of refuge. I was really feeling it in my body, and I was thinking how I picture refuge as a physical place, but how that only derives from an internal feeling. You know, we can only create refuge if we have a sense of it in ourselves and in our relationships. Then we can create refuge. And I feel that same sensibility of what you're saying here. You know, like how do we take care of the world? Drive a kid to their after school program. Save the world. You know, and not diminish that is an essential ingredient in the world. Yeah, and open to that relationship with somebody who's real younger. You know, they might be on their phone the whole time. That might be confusing. It might be unfamiliar. It might be like, what do you? I don't even know what we're talking about. TikTok. I don't know what that is. But could be enriching.
There's great reciprocity in working with a young
Yeah.
person because they help you figure out your iPhone.
Young people. Yeah, and the humility to engage that relationship fully. Again, thank you. Okay. Well, complete was the one I was saying to Charlie. The one thing when I'm sick is I can't keep track of the time. So my talks get long. I appreciate you hanging in there with me. Thank you very much. Yeah. So we can do the closing chant. I'll put that in the chat as well. It's a full chat if you haven't had a chance to look at it. Okay. Okay. Thank you for being here this morning. For great Bodhisattva vows, beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are infinite. I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is boundless. I